The great painter, Pablo Picasso, has this great quote. He says, "You can honor tradition by wearing your grandfather's hat or by having grandchildren. Both have appeal. I don't wear my grandfather's hat, but I do on occasion wear my grandfather's tie clip. But I also have children who one day may have children of their own. By wearing this clip, I am honoring Charles Kearns by donning his garb. And by raising children, I'm working on building a legacy. I'm inviting new little Kearnses to come into the world and to live out their life, hopefully in a way that reflects the Kearns family values so that it can pass on from generation to generation." You see the difference now between wearing the hat and having grandchildren? See, one simply requires that you assume the appearance of tradition, and the other requires some care and some nurture so that the family's traditions can adapt to generational changes. And I think Picasso's wisdom applies to the church too. But the problem is the church tends to gravitate towards the hat and the tie clip, which means we end up spending a lot of time and energy putting on the same garb and doing the same things. And why is that? Well, it's because that's the way we have been taught to honor tradition. Having grandchildren in the church, I think, to me, means making disciples. And making disciples gives us a much different opportunity to honor tradition. By making disciples, we carry on the core values of the church into future generations, all the while acknowledging that the fashions and the customs and things like that are going to change over time. Wearing the hat is all about nostalgia, okay? And you know what? Nostalgia is fun, right? Nostalgia is a lot of fun because I remember, I don't know how many of you have seen this. Has anybody seen George Lucas's first movie, American Graffiti? Anybody remember that one? Okay. Wow, you all need to take a film class. That's actually, my oldest son Graham took a film class, and one of the first movies they watched was actually American Graffiti. That movie was released in 1973, but the story took place in the summer of 1962. And this story struck a chord in audiences because this was before the Vietnam War, or at least it was before we started deploying mass amounts of troops over into Vietnam. It was before much of the civil unrest that marked the mid-60s and further. This was before Kennedy was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr., all the riots, all the craziness. In a lot of ways, American Graffiti was really about a transition between one era and another, which was appropriate because the movie itself focused on two young men who it was their last free night of the summer before they moved on to college, before they went off to college. So for many, this movie represented the end of happier days and the beginning of some very troubling days. And the movie was popular, I believe, not because it was a particularly good movie, but because it appealed to people's sense of nostalgia. Because the message seemed to say the 1950s and early 60s were good. Wouldn't it be nice to go back? And what popular TV show came on in 1974 that was similar to American Graffiti?
Happy Days.
Happy Days, you bet. It was almost like American Graffiti Light for television. They even got, for those of you who have not seen American Graffiti, they even got Ron Howard, the actor who played the main character in American Graffiti, to be the main character in Happy Days. That's how much they wanted to appeal to the folks who liked that nostalgia for the 50s. And then a couple of decades later, what came on TV? What other nostalgia show can you think of?
All in the Family.
That wasn't necessarily, we'll touch on All in the Family, but I'm thinking of, anybody ever hear or watch That 70s Show? That was after I stopped watching TV, so I've honestly never seen an episode of That 70s Show, but there was an appeal to people who really liked the 70s. And then after that, there was a show called That 80s Show that didn't go over so well, but I get it because I grew up in the 80s too, so you know. We love nostalgia. But the problem is nostalgia has two serious problems. First of all, the world was never what we imagined it was. Does that make sense? We tend to romanticize the past. Now notice they spend a lot of time on these television shows focusing on the fashion and the hair and the music and the idioms of the language during the time, but it's all about the good times. It's all about, hey, remember when? Remember, let's go back to All in the Family. Well, remember when Archie and Edith were sitting at the piano and they were singing this duet about all the way Glenn Miller played songs that made the hit parade? Guys like us, we had it made. Those were the days. They were obviously longing for a time that felt better to them, that felt more comfortable for them. Now lately it seems that we gravitate towards shows that go way back in history, to a time that, was around before any of us were born. The show that I'm thinking about right now is Downton Abbey. Anybody in here a Downton Abbey fan? We got some Downton Abbey fans in here. I apologize ahead of time for what I'm about ready to say about Downton Abbey. The series is set in this fictional Yorkshire country house, and it follows the lives of the aristocratic, is it Crowley family? The Crowley family. And their servants, and this was during the reign of King George V. And it starts out in the year, I think, 1912, and I think it kind of hops around a little bit until somewhere in the early 1920s. Folks love this show. They love it. It's filled with all sorts of little nods to events in history that shaped the early 20th century. You got the Titanic and World War I and all sorts of little things like that. And you get to see both, those little things like the Great War, and little things. But you get to see both sides of these events through two different cultural eyes. You get to see it through the aristocrat's eyes and the servant's eyes. And it's cute, and it's clever, and it's quite popular in England, and it's quite popular here in the States, too. The problem is Downton Abbey is a crock. Yep, I said it, and I'm sorry, Beth, I'm sorry, Terry, but the relationship between the servants and the aristocrats are portrayed in a manner that is way more familiar and informal than what was normal or expected during that time in history. For example, in the show, servants below the level of butler and housekeeper regularly ignore protocol and address senior members of the family with personal requests and opinions and observations and things like that, stuff that would never happen during that time. They use language that is way too modern. There are so many things wrong with that show. But the same can be said for Happy Days and That 70s Show and MASH and Mad Men and whatever period show that you're talking about. Because nostalgia is always looked at through a distorted lens. We don't know what the world of Downton Abbey was like because we weren't there. And so we project what we're familiar with in the present in order to make the past more palatable, more familiar. Here's the second problem with nostalgia, especially as it relates to the events and times that we can remember because we were there. We like to hold on to ideas that don't work. we get frustrated when something doesn't work. And then what's the first thing we say? We say, well, I remember the good old days. And think back to the 50s or 60s or 70s or whatever time we thought were the good old days. And then we have to say, do we really want to relive the 1950s? Were they really happy days? Well, sure, if you were a straight, white, upwardly mobile Protestant male, they were great. Like Archie Bunker says, guys like us, we had it made. But our scripture this morning is part of a series of events that were happening in the life of the people of Israel who were wandering out in the wilderness. We're catching them here in one of these awkward, nostalgic moments. You see, they were tired of wandering around in the wilderness. They were sick of manna. Manna flakes. Banana bread. Manna everything. They were tired of not having a permanent roof over their heads. In the section that Margaret read this morning, they were about ready to stone Moses because they were so thirsty. They were so tired of being in the wilderness, not knowing for sure where their next meal or where their next drink of water was going to come from, that they started longing for the good old days back in Egypt. Yeah, but they were slaves in Egypt, right?
Yes.
They got fed.
But that was 40 years ago. They don't remember.
Yeah, right. Well, no. What's sad is this is early on in the journey.
Oh.
You know, this is still fairly. This is before the Decalogue was given, the Ten Commandments. But you know, they were in Egypt. They were under a lot of stress. They're under a lot of stress out in the wilderness for sure, but there were a lot of stress in Egypt too. They were being mistreated. They were literally being worked to death. So why in the world would they long for that sort of life again? Well, because they also remembered having semi-permanent shelter. They remembered having regular meals, as gross as they may have been. They remember having water provided for them, even though the ones who brought them the water were mistreating them. The quality of life was lousy, but it was predictable. Out in the wilderness, they weren't sure about anything. Well, you know, there was God's promise that they would be provided for, but in their experience, promises weren't always honored. And it took them a while to learn that God's promises are solid. So they're like, we want to go back to Egypt. Like, really? Are you really that nostalgic for Egypt? Was their music really that good? Was their food really that good? Was the simplicity and predictability of life really worth it? Even though you had no choice? Even though you had no freedom? Well, even though the stakes are different, the church can get caught up in this little nostalgia game too. Do we really want the 1950s again? I know there are plenty of folks who remember the 1950s and they would feel a great deal of anxiety at the prospect of going back there again. So what do folks in the church do? Well, we call ministers in to help the church move past all of the bad things from that era, but still try to keep the general template of how church was done. But the problem is that's not really working, nor is it helping matters much. So here's the reality. Part of the human struggle is to find contentment. Part of what makes life so difficult is that no matter where we are, some of us will never be content in the here and now. We long for something else. We long for somewhere else. We long for some when else. Not only do we idealize and long for for the years past, but sometimes we idealize and long for the future, things that haven't happened yet. We'll say things like, oh, things will get better when. Oh, things will get better when I graduate from high school. Or things will get better when I'm married. Or things will get better when I'm divorced. Or
Interjection.
yes, sir.
When I was in the service,
Mhm.
they said, cheer up, Jerry, things will get worse. I cheered up, and they did get worse.
And they did get worse, see? Optimists are always disappointed, pessimists are blessings all the time. It happens. We say, oh, things will get better when I have kids, when I get retired, when I get the promotion, when I get the inheritance, whatever. We long just as much for a future as we do for the nostalgia of the past. But the lesson of the Israelites in the wilderness is you can only deal with your own life in the here and now. Yes, there was the promise of the promised land, but the people had to figure out how to live in the here and now. They had to figure out how to live day to day in the wilderness first. The here and now is the most important thing. And our obligation to our faith tradition is faithfulness in the here and now. See what I'm saying? That's what gives things life. Living faithfully in the here and now. And it's funny, when we gather at this table every week, we see these words etched into our table here. This do in remembrance of me. And then someone, including myself on a number of occasions, will say, well, 2,000 years ago, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de. And the problem is that the Lord's Supper is not a nostalgic moment. Because for us to remember, as it says here on the table, is to put life into the table here and now. See, the Lord's table is actually a forward-looking thing. It's not necessarily a time to think back to what Jesus did. It's supposed to encourage us to do what Jesus did here and now. So think about that as we gather at the table this morning. Let's pray.